All right, cool. Well, hi everyone. It's wonderful to be here again, and so wonderful to be able to talk to all of you about Le Fanu, who I've spent so much time thinking about. Um, and it's hard to kind of narrow down what to talk about with Le Fanu because there's so much to be said about him. This figure who's given us iconic monsters like Carmilla and a demon monkey, who brings us face to face with the fairies and who illustrates the quite non-supernatural horror of patriarchal power structures that make human communities every bit as terrifying as any decaying castle or ancestral ghost. However, I think one of the most fascinating, most relevant, and indeed most terrifying aspects of this work is the way in which it deals with reality as something that's created within communities, rather than something that's simply universal and can be taken for granted. Reality, in this case, therefore, is a collection of sociopolitical and material sets of rules, or paradigms, governing what is real and acceptable versus unreal and unacceptable. In Le Fanu's fiction, we see how communities are communally created and maintained, but also how such visions of reality in his stories' communities can be woefully unable to account for and act on the community's greatest crises. And as a result, the reality of these communities can terrifyingly deteriorate. Their power structures and the regimes of socio-political and scientific knowledge that make up their vision of reality are brought into question when they encounter things in the world that exist outside their vision of reality. Their collective reality becomes uncertain, and it becomes unclear if that reality can adequately allow its occupants to navigate the world around them. And if a community's vision of reality is incapable of allowing the community to adequately navigate the world, perhaps other visions of reality might replace it. To talk about this process of reality creation and destruction, I'm primarily going to discuss Le Fanu's The Haunted Baronet, a rather longish short story from his collection, The Chronicles of Golden Friars, though I'll refer to other Le Fanu stories along the way. However, don't worry, you don't need to have read any of these for this talk, so, don't log off just yet. So I'll be splitting this talk into three main sections with as Sam said, a short pause between each one to give you a bit of a chance for a break. And each of these sections is broadly dedicated to each of our three main point of view characters in the story. And we'll see each one of them become steadily less able to occupy their community's reality. Before meeting these characters, though, let's briefly look at the historical context into which this work was written. So Le Fanu was born in 1814 into a Huguenot family residing in Ireland and was a member of the Protestant ascendancy, a term popularized by Edmund Burke to describe this dominant class. This class held political supremacy and economic supremacy in Ireland. This minority ruling class was having its supremacy challenged, though, during Le Fanu's lifetime by social and legislative victories by the native Irish Catholic majority. 1829 saw Catholic emancipation, which allowed Catholics to take parliament seats in Westminster, and 1869 saw the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, meaning the Anglican Church institution could no longer collect tithes in Ireland. The means by which this Protestant ascendancy was maintained were therefore being challenged. There was periodic unrest on the island too, some of which Le Fanu's immediate family experienced in Abington, County Limerick, and there were serious challenges to land ownership in Ireland that would bubble up later in the 19th century, again making the position of the landed ascendancy class uncertain. Further, in the middle of the century, Ireland witnessed a devastating famine, a near apocalyptic event that was exacerbated by a British administration unable or even unwilling to adequately solve the crisis. As the century wore on, a growing nationalist movement was articulating, in political and cultural terms, opposition to British control, and creating nationalist images of Irish futures that were inspiring and seemed closer and closer to becoming realized. A change was in the air, picked up on by Le Fanu himself, who stated that the British administration had, and these are his words, failed in the hour of danger to redeem her pledge of protection, and had left Protestants to abide the assaults of their malignant, inveterate enemies. He, it seems, felt the deterioration of his class's way of life. Of course, Le Fanu never saw the full defeat of the Protestant ascendancy. Similarly, Le Fanu never saw the end of the British colonial administration of Ireland, which propped up his class. This is an end that would come in the following century. However, what he did bear witness to was this decline, in which this minority ruling class was losing its domination in Ireland bit by fitful bit. Amidst these threats of radical sociopolitical paradigm shifts, where political and economic structures of ascendancy Ireland might be torn down, radical changes in scientific knowledge were resulting in paradigm shifts in material knowledge of the world. Perhaps the most famous of these being Darwin's theory of evolution that profoundly shook conceptions of selfhood and narratives about humanity and what being human entails. As I said before, reality here means a collection of social and material paradigms deciding what's acceptable and real. In Le Fanu's historical moment, we're seeing paradigms of a social and material vision of reality in which Le Fanu was living, being powerfully confronted by alternate sociopolitical and material paradigms. His fiction, I think, finds powerful ways to comment on this situation. Now, for all of these reasons, it's tempting to discuss Le Fanu's work as an allegory for the plight of the ascendancy, that its characters and events represent particular fears of the class to which Le Fanu belonged. You know, the lesbian vampire standing in for threatening native Irish political forces, a demon monkey standing in for anxiety about Darwinian evolution, that sort of thing. And that's not a bad approach to his fiction. It's a tradition in Irish literary criticism to look at 19th century literary narratives as domestic allegories for Irish political concerns, and that's not an unfounded impulse. However, I think there are other ways to find the relevance of Le Fanu's fiction to his historical moment, to find the fears of that moment embedded in his fiction, that might also somewhat avoid the tendency of allegory to reduce these stories to a series of stand-ins for real-world concerns. I think it's by experiencing this fictional world in a less allegorical manner that we can viscerally fear this work's relevance to us. Viscerally feel this work's relevance to us, rather. Because by inhabiting this world, rather than completely reducing it to an allegory that we might, decode, we can viscerally experience this feeling of trying to maintain a reality, the fear of feeling it deteriorate. And through that experience, gain a better understanding of the flawed ways in which we attempt to uphold broken sociopolitical and scientific paradigms. So in an interview published in the journal Gothic Studies, author China Mieville discusses the radical possibilities of what he calls radical naivety and forgetting. It's the act of becoming completely immersed in a story such that the literalism of its metaphors invigorates both its metaphor and internal reality. The effect of Le Fanu's fiction largely relies on a similar act of radical naivety, of becoming immersed in the literalism or realness of Le Fanu's fictional world in order to empower the fictional world we're inhabiting and its real-world significance. Thus, we are, to quote Mieville again, inhabiting a kind of space in which critical intuition can hit us because we're inhabiting the totality of a work of art. In other words, becoming radically naive and fully inhabiting this fictional world as real allows us a more powerful experience of its commentary. Let's talk a bit then about what it might mean to be immersed in the world Le Fanu's created for us, and what commentary we might gain from that immersion. Now, when I mention his fictional world, I don't mean he created a Westeros or Tatooine or something like that. His fiction takes place on Earth and largely maps onto our world, just occupied with his own characters and fictional events and the odd fictional town. Le Fanu's body of fiction is almost always delivered to us by a narrator who exists in Le Fanu's fictional world, writing documents for others in that world to read. We're thus being addressed as occupants of this world, hearing reports of events in that world that we haven't borne direct witness to. Each of his texts thus acts not as a direct rendering of Le Fanu's fictional world, but rather as an imperfect lens into that world that is rendered through the narrator's perspective. It's as though we're reading a newspaper, written by a journalist, talking about events that we cannot see, that have taken place in our world. Further, Le Fanu's body of work, with its shared narrators, characters who cross from one story to another, and events that occur in one work only to be remembered in another, creates a vision of an interconnected world that we're viewing through the different perspectives that each of his stories presents to us. Le Fanu's tales thus individually and collectively impart a sense that there's a larger world we're only seeing in disparate and imperfect parts, similar to how we view our own world. Viewing his stories in this way, our engagement with them as reader might not be to decode them as allegorical, to figure out what allegorical meaning we might discover in their disparate parts, but rather to put ourselves in the fictional position of reading real-world documents that form the imperfect lenses through which we might perceive and interpret this world, and to examine the implications of that position we're being called into. In Le Fanu's story, The Haunted Baronet, we're learning about events long since passed through this document. The narrator was not present for these events. The narrator even draws attention to the subjective nature of their narration by using the first person. The narrator also subtly alludes to the fact that they're cobbling together parts of the story based on disparate perspectives on these events, a common aspect of Le Fanu's narrators who must sometimes cobble together information from different sources to form their narrative. Our vision of this world through this story is thus one made by communing with the perspective of the narrator, who themselves exists in Le Fanu's world, whose own vision of the world seems to be constructed in tandem with other people's perspectives. It's a bit like reading a newspaper. When you read an article talking about an event, the writer is rendering that event from their perspective, and their perspective has inevitably been formed in numerous ways by engaging with other people, internalizing elements of the perspective of the community or communities around them. They've thus internalized perhaps a common language, perhaps a roughly common vision of what is legal and illegal, internalizing certain moral views held in common, and material laws about how the world works. Also, their vision of the specific events in question has likely been formed in communication and consultation with various members of the community. Then, our understanding of that event is begotten by joining our perspective to that of the writer through the act of reading, through which we internalize elements of that perspective, or at least we might internalize elements of that perspective, and might bring those internalized elements into our communication with others in our community. Now, this all might be a little oversimplistic, but I think we can imagine our engagement with Le Fanu's works similarly. In reading Le Fanu's stories, we're presented with the possibility of internalizing a narrator's perspective that has at least in part been socially formed with others. And since we're being called by these works to imagine ourselves as inhabitants of Le Fanu's fictional world, we can imagine ourselves bringing that internalized perspective into our interactions with others in that world, thus helping to perpetuate certain material and social paradigms. And therefore, we could help to reify a clear communal vision of reality, much as we see characters in Le Fanu's tales do, which I'll demonstrate in just a moment. Keep this idea of us as participants in this reality creation process in mind. It's just kind of occurring in the background as we read the start of the story. But as the events of the story go on, our ability to subscribe to the vision of reality we're being presented with becomes uncertain. We start to realize this vision of reality is flawed, and this reality creation process we're involved with while reading these texts will start to break down around us. So, with all of that in mind, let's give ourselves a bit of a framework within which to examine the process by which a sense of reality is built and maintained in Le Fanu's fictional communities. And a useful framework for this is social constructionism. Though Le Fanu's work long precedes the popularization of social constructionism as a common sociological theory, it nonetheless provides valuable insight into the ways in which characters in Le Fanu's stories actively form and maintain their reality within their communities. Vivian Burr distills social constructionism with its many disparate strains and disciplinary applications to some key tenets. Through a social constructionist lens, knowledge is sustained by social processes, and through interactions between people, our version of knowledge becomes fabricated. This theoretical framework, social constructionism, also holds that language is a precondition for thought, and thus concepts and categories acquired by each person as they develop the use of language. Sorry, I said that wrong. Concepts and categories are acquired by each person as they develop the use of language and are thus reproduced by everyone who shares a culture and a language. Through this framework, we can therefore recognize the ways in which Le Fanu's characters, our narrator, and even we, through existing in communities together, rhetorically build and maintain the paradigms with which we can collectively observe, categorize, and act on the world through interactions with one another. For a kind of simple example of this, Le Fanu's most famous novel, Uncle Silas, has this hero, Maud, who has been given a proper, if somewhat neglectful upbringing by her father and the various employees on his estate. And she later encounters her cousin Millie, a girl who has been completely neglected by her father, given no such upbringing. Through her neglect, Maud has degenerated from the perspective of upright English society, at least. She doesn't know how to speak with proper upper-class diction. Her voice is rendered like many upper-class authors render the peasant class. She also doesn't understand womanly crafts or arts, those things that Maud has internalized. And Maud, having her proper education, instructs Millie in proper womanhood through their interactions with one another. Maud, in interactions with her social context, internalizes these norms and reproduces them through language, through her interactions with Millie, to ensure a collective paradigm of upper crust girlhood is propagated. Thus, rules about what is materially real and socially acceptable are configured, reproduced, and reified within the community through interactions in that community. It's appropriate then that the start of the Haunted Baronet swiftly transports us to a scene of communal storytelling, in which characters attempt to communally reify the reality of their communities, the reality of their community's history through conversation. At the beginning of the Haunted Baronet, we're introduced to what the narrator calls 3 or 4 of the old habitués of the bar who are collectively discussing a drowning. This drowning occurred a long time ago in a lake at the center of Golden Friars being the community in which this story is set. One of these men, Jack Amerald, asks about Sir Bale, the local baronet, saying, "Didn't he drown a woman and her child in the lake?" Another responds, "Hello, my dear boy, don't let them hear you say that. You're all in the clouds." Jack Amerald put his foot on the floor. "Well, if it wasn't him, it was someone else. Someone here told me the bearings, I'd take my oath, where the body was seen, and yet no boat could ever come up with it, and that was clear." To which a man named Turnbull responds, "Aye, sir, there was some flummery like that, captain, for folk will be gathered, but 'twas his grandsire was talked to, not him, and would play the hangman with me down here if it was thought there were stories like that passed him in this bar. There never was no proof, captain, no more than smoke." So we already see here a collective attempt to reify a coherent, true vision of whatever happened in this town. The owner of the pub, after this kind of introduction, after a bit of prompting by the people around him, with commentary by these gathered men, proceeds to tell the story of what happened. So here's what the owner of the pub, alongside these other men, kind of narrate. So they say that years ago, a woman named Mary Feltrim apparently fell for an awful man 20 years her senior named Jasper Mardyce. Some say they were married, others say their relationship lacked a priest's blessing. She tried to get him to confirm the marriage out in the open, which he didn't do, and he instead married another lady and then evicted both Mary and her children from his estate. One of our chief characters in the drama to come, Philip Feltrim, is a descendant of Mary Feltrim. Mary, after being evicted, disappeared, but people claim to see a woman, perhaps Mary, who rises out of the lake with a baby in her arms, frightening travelers. We're thus brought to the modern day, where Philip Feltrim, descendant of Mary, is destitute, living under the protection of Sir Bale Mardyce, a descendant of Jasper Mardyce, an inheritor of Jasper's estate. And Sir Bale absolutely torments poor Feltrim. So aside from some general background here that will become important, such as Feltrim and Sir Bale's family history, the main thing I'd like to point out is that these men are together rhetorically negotiating and building the narrative of their community, negotiating collectively what the real history and legendary history of their community is. They're taking part in that social constructionist process of building their reality through language and exchange. Additionally here, we see how that process is constrained by authority structures in the community. They collectively illustrate these local legends, configuring them together, but they limit what they speak and countenance because they could invoke the wrath of authority figures like Surveil. Thus, their communal storytelling is in communication with their broader social context as well. We therefore see here the social forces that interact with and help to shape this reality creation process. The storytelling here is one element, therefore, in a larger process by which the community builds its sense of reality, of deciding what is socially and materially real or acceptable. The narrator is thus engaging with this reality building process by internalizing elements of it and communicating it to us. And then we engage in it by analyzing and internalizing elements of this scene the narrator is offering us. We might then, imagining ourselves as occupants of Le Fanu's fictional world, we might then communicate that internalized perspective in conversation with others. Now, this chart, might be a bit oversimplistic since we're talking about different time periods, different communities, etc. But hopefully it helps to communicate something of the manner in which we're being implicated in this reality creation process. That we're both viewing a clear instance of reality building in the text and being imaginatively pulled into that process of reality building as imaginative occupants of Le Fanu's fictional world. However, in Le Fanu's fiction, certain socially constructed visions of reality begin to seem inadequate to the experiences of people living under those realities. The visions of reality created within Le Fanu's fictional communities often are not primarily aimed at allowing the community to better navigate the world they find themselves in. Often, the communities in question do real harm to members of those communities, especially to the vulnerable, in service of maintaining a coherent, though ineffective, vision of reality. In Carmilla, Le Fanu's most famous story, we meet Laura, a young girl who encounters a vampire. Her father's denial of and inability to recognize the vampiric threat attacking his daughter is not just an example of an ignorant character, but an authority figure unwilling to consider altering the vision of reality he lives under to better protect those who live under it. Similar in that story is the Imperial Commission, an Austrian legal body that swoops in and performs a legal execution of the vampire, after which we're assured the vampiric threat is over. Now, that would be convincing if our main character and many others hadn't been bitten by a vampire over the course of the story, which we're told results in the bitten becoming a vampire after death. Laura even ends her story stating, "Often from reverie I have started, fancying I heard the light step of Carmilla," who's the vampire in question, "at the drawing room door." The supernatural threat appears to be obliterated in the community's official account, in their reality that can now once again exclude vampires. But the lingering trauma of Laura, in addition to doubts we must harbor about vampires really being gone, undermine Laura's ability and our ability to unproblematically accept the reality that her community is trying to maintain. We can analyze their efforts at maintaining reality and thus see that those efforts at determining what is real and unreal are flawed. The official version of reality socially maintained in Carmilla impedes rather than facilitates people's ability to effectively navigate the world. We see a similar kind of counterproductive vision of reality in the Haunted Baronet too. In the Haunted Baronet, we see an official version of reality being maintained in the story's community, Golden Friars, through that reality creation process. It's a supposedly rational vision of reality that seems quite similar to the one maintained by Laura's father in Carmilla. We'll also see things deemed unreal challenge that reality. An alternate reality appears and starts to invade, starts to suggest that the official vision of reality we're engaging with as readers might be inadequate to the world we and these characters find ourselves in. much as the emergence of the vampire did in Carmilla. We start to see flaws in the reality maintained in this community, which might harm community members and make us resistant to internalizing that perspective on Le Fanu's world. We'll see that borne out over the course of the story. So to return back to the Haunted Baronet itself, after the collectively narrated story about the drowned woman, we're introduced to our resident sad boy, feltrim, a man who's constantly sad about his state and about the abuse constantly thrown at him by his benefactor, Sir Bale. And we're introduced to Sir Bale's maid, Miss Julopper, who is Feltrim's only real companion in the world, it seems. And a problem they're presented with is that Feltrim starts to feel he's being possessed. The narrator states, "There is a faculty in man that will acknowledge the unseen. He may scout and scare religion from him, but if he does, superstition perches near." Feltrim is growing in his acknowledgement of the unseen, the supernatural unreal that exists outside the frameworks of his community's constructed reality. He states, "Well, Miss Julopper, dreams I've dreamed like other people, old and young, but this man has taken fast hold of me. I think, Miss Julopper, it's getting into me. I think it's like possession. I think there's something trying to influence me. Perhaps it's the way fellows go mad, but it won't let me alone. I've seen it 3 times, think of that." This unseen, unreal thing starts to become more than a tall tale told in a bar, and instead exerts its supposedly unreal influence on Feltrim, creeping into the narrative frame more and more, making his own identity more uncertain. It's no longer just a tale, but something that can directly exert influence over community members. This growing acknowledgement of the unseen is precisely what Miss Julopper tries to make Feltrim let go of. She's one of many figures that reasserts and reifies a vision of reality that precludes such supernatural events through interactions with others. Indeed, while certain supernatural stories do flourish in the community, as we saw at the bar, we continually see attempts in this story to thwart the countenancing of such things as real or able to exert any tangible influence on community members. Miss Julopper consoles Feltrim after he mentions this possible possession, not by addressing the possession, but instead by calling it fancies and turning back to the more manageable problem of his earthly tormentor, Sir Bale. She states, "You should think of all the blessings you have and not be making mountains and molehills. And those little bits of temper Sir Bale shows, why, no one minds them. That is to take him to heart like you do, don't you see?" She offers him tea here, but then soon ups her drink game to alcohol instead of tea to enforce a kind of forgetting of his troubles, it seems. Her response to his vision of the unreal seems rooted in kindness. And, it definitely seems to be, Julopper being the kind woman she is in the story. But it's still an attempt to dull his senses, to make him forget such unreal notions, and to lessen Feltrim's perception of legitimate grievance against an authority figure. These actions, therefore, take part in enforcing a clear boundary between that which is real and that which is unreal, as well as between what is socially acceptable and unacceptable. The supernatural is unreal, shouldn't be countenanced. The abuse from Sir Bale, an authority figure, is acceptable, natural, shouldn't be acted against. She upholds material and social paradigms of this official reality. So in this act of communication, the paradigms of this communal reality are upheld. We soon see a far more aggressive version of reifying this official vision of reality. Now, unfortunately, and sorry for any of you who've gotten attached to him in the short time he's been with us, but poor Feltrim does die, or apparently dies. And Sir Bale's response to this death quite aggressively reasserts this official vision of reality. So let's back up a bit. How does Feltrim die? Feltrim's accused by his benefactor, Sir Bale, of stealing. Sir Bale, while always cruel to Feltrim, is particularly cruel now. So Feltrim decides to leave, crossing the lake that has produced so many supernatural tales in order to escape the malicious Sir Bale. According to witnesses, a hand reaches up out of the lake and pulls Feltrim in, lending even more veracity to his acknowledgement of the unreal and to the multiple sightings of the drowned woman by people in the community. That which is deemed unreal is becoming more and more verified and aggressive. Feltrim is fished out of the lake by some of the people who are with him and brought back to his abuser, Sir Bale, where he's pronounced dead by a medical doctor named Torby. Dr. Torby will become relevant in just a moment. Feltrim's apparent death here might be seen as a challenge to the community's regimes of knowledge, and on some level, its social hierarchy. His death, like other supernatural deaths in Le Fanu's fiction, appears to violate commonly accepted rules about what is real and able to affect human lives. It might undermine confidence, too, in the ability of this community's power structures and frameworks of knowledge to protect its occupants against such threats. It also undermines Sir Bale's aristocratic authority specifically. It makes plain Sir Bale's cruelty, since his cruelty is what drove Feltrim into the lake. Him being one of the causes of Feltrim's death, therefore, brings into question the efficacy of his aristocratic right to power, as his leadership has actively worsened the situation of those living under that leadership. The paradigm of hereditary authority within this reality is therefore potentially undermined. Sir Bale's attempts to assuage such concerns, which come soon after Feltrim's death, display the often rhetorical battle between that which is deemed real and that which is deemed unreal in Le Fanu's stories. Through interactions with his staff after Feltrim's apparent death, Sir Bale attempts to get a sanitized version of this event solidified in the official collective remembrance of it, thus rhetorically ensuring the maintenance of the reigning Golden Friar's vision of reality. He says to his servants, "Bear you this in mind. Miss Julapper there can tell you more about it. She knows that it was certainly in no compliance with my wish that he left the house tonight." Thus kind of framing Miss Julapper as a corroborating witness, willing or no, and framing the events as resulting from Feltrim's own obstinate perversity, and perhaps, I forgive him for it, a wish in his unreasonable resentment to throw some blame on this house. He shifts blame away from himself and from the reigning power structures that allowed him power over Feltrim, and he shifts the blame to Feltrim. He then mostly ignores the supernatural elements of the story, simply stating to the attending Dr. Torby, "It's a melancholy ending, poor fellow. You must come to the study with me, doctor, and talk a little bit more, and you must have a glass of sherry or some port. The port used not to be bad here." Sir Bale switches himself from vindictive tyrant to gracious host, plying Dr. Torby with Torby's personal weakness, wine, in order to ensure Torby complies with Bale's framing of this event. Bale has effectively changed Feltrim's death from a worrying prospect that might challenge the efficacy of current power structures and visions of what is materially real, and instead portrays Feltrim's demise as Feltrim's own personal failing, which can be backed up by an unwilling Miss Julapper and a drunk Dr. Torby. These efforts to solidify reality, often in spectacularly short-sighted, misguided ways, pop up throughout Le Fanu's fiction. We see a quite explicit example of this in Green Tea, the one with the demon monkey I mentioned before. This whole narrative, Green Tea, is the testimony of Dr. Hesselius, a spiritualist physician treating the Reverend Jennings, who is afflicted by a demonic simian figure. As with the Haunted Baronet, Le Fanu draws our attention to the distance between the official account and whatever actually happened. And the account serves Dr. Hesselius' authority, much as Sir Bale serves his. This is most obvious in the end of the tale, when Jennings, after treatment by Dr. Hesselius, kills himself. Hesselius narrates how we should interpret Jennings' death after the fact, stating that Jennings' death is Jennings' own fault, that Jennings did array himself on the side of the disease, and that Hesselius hadn't actually begun to treat Jennings, therefore preserving a 100% success rate when treating such ailments. His narration blatantly and crudely reframes the narrative we have just been told in service of a coherent vision of reality, serving a stable vision of medical authority and the general safety of community members. So long as men are strong and trust in said medical authority, they should be fine, if we're to believe this interpretation. Such attempts by Hesselius to assure the wider community that problems like Jennings can be dealt with by existing frameworks of knowledge and social organization leave such communities vulnerable, as their knowledge and social organization cannot actually protect them. Jennings did array himself against this disease. He did try to get help from Dr. Hesselius. Dr. Hesselius just couldn't help him. The demonic monkey, it seems, did cause Jennings' death. Hesselius' account, an intervention like Sir Bale's into the reality creation process. Messed up that sentence a little bit. Hesselius' account, an intervention like Sir Bale's into the reality creation process to maintain a clear sense of reality, demonstrates the quite cruel way in which power is wrenched away from people like Jennings. Jennings is patronizingly designated here poor Mr. Jennings by Hesselius. He's rendered a pitiable figure, dead by a disease that could have been weathered by better men. Jennings and his voice, like the dead feltrims, are degraded, and authority structures and regimes of knowledge in the community are upheld. The vulnerable are sacrificed to maintain a clear vision of reality. Bale's and Hesselius' acts of weaving potentially disruptive events into the tapestry of their reality are part of a wider regime of authority figures in Le Fanu's fictional communities, who are especially empowered in this reality creation process, who use their power to lead that process and maintain a kind of hegemonic reality. So let's go a bit more in depth into the role of authority figures in the story in terms of upholding such hegemony. Italian socialist Antonio Gramsci's analysis of the power structures in which hegemony is formed helps articulate the function of authority figures in configuring hegemonic visions of reality in Le Fanu's texts. Gramsci scholar Adam David Morton states, "It's significant that all people were actually recognized by Gramsci as intellectuals, but only some were noted to have an immediate social function as professional intellectuals. This latter function would involve active participation in everyday life as an agent within the economic, political, social, and cultural fields, acting as a constructor, organizer, and permanent persuader in forming or contesting hegemony." Authority figures in Le Fanu's fiction take on a similar function to Gramsci's professional intellectuals, becoming crucial elements within the complex structure by which reality is communally created, actively working to uphold a hegemonic vision of reality. They, like these professional intellectuals, are crucial in that process of creating and maintaining a cultural hegemony, or in Le Fanu's case, a coherent hegemonic sense of reality. So if reality is something that's constructed in interactions among people, creating coherent regimes of knowledge and social formation, here we see who is especially empowered in that process and how they wield that power to lead that process towards a coherent communal sense of reality. We can see Sir Bale's alighting of disruptions to his reality, or Hesselius' similar efforts in this way, as key interventions by authority figures into the communal reality creation process, keeping that process aimed at maintaining a hegemonic, existing vision of reality. I'd like to introduce another such authority figure in Golden Friars, and that's Dr. Torby, who's described as one of the dignitaries of Golden Friars. We mentioned him previously. He's the one who Sir Bale kind of convinces to support his understanding or his version of events. And he's also the man who pronounced Feltrim dead. And in doing that, he helps to uphold Sir Bale's power, as well as that hegemonic vision of reality we've been talking about. So after Torby is plied with Bale's port and flatteries, Torby is convinced to vehemently declare that Sir Bale has done everything possible to ensure Feltrim's survival. Indeed, Torby is part of Sir Bale's attempts to paint these events in a favorable light, because Bale, to quote the narrator, could not afford to lose anyone's good word just now. And the doctor was a bit of a gossip, and in most houses in the region, in one character or another, every 3 months in the year. The doctor's medical authority is used less as a tool of facilitating knowledge and bodily healing here than as a tool of hegemony. The emphasis placed here is on his ability to reinforce Bale's legitimacy, and this marks him out as more of an agent of preserving Sir Bale's authority as aristocratic leader in the Golden Friars community than as a healer. Torby thus takes this potentially disruptive event, Feltrim's death, and weaves it comfortably into a narrative that preserves the social reality of this community by propping up paradigmatic aristocratic power structures with medical authority. Additionally, Dr. Torby uses his authority to restore clear boundaries between what is materially real and unreal. He'll later balk at suspicions that supernatural things are happening, stating that all that's happened is merely commonplace, and that anything seemingly supernatural is, and this is him speaking, is just like that fisherman's story about the hand that drew Feltrim into the water on the night he was nearly drowned. Torby rhetorically links these thoughts that fall outside of acceptable reality to that of the lower classes that ascribed such supernatural elements to Feltrim's death, and he promptly leaves such people out of his requirements for valid subjectivity. He says, everyone can see what that was. Why, of course, it was simply the reflection of his own hand in the water in that vivid lightning. These fishermen cannot be considered everyone in Torby's estimation because of their identification of the supernatural. Torby is asserting the primacy of his own perception by only assigning valid subjectivity to those who subscribe to the reigning vision of reality. As such, he might vaguely ascribe his opinion to have the backing of everyone. He ensures the fishermen have very little authority in collectively determining what reality is. Therefore, even though we get hints of these kind of pockets of superstitious belief in the community, an official vision of this communal reality is maintained by the authoritative interventions of authority figures like Sir Bale and like Dr. Torby into this reality creation process, even when events occur that threaten their vision. This act of solidifying a clear hegemonic schema of social and material reality might have seemed familiar to the Victorians. Robin Gilmore states that Victorian seriousness about religion, morals, and science were contrasted with being in uncharted waters in a progression from rural and mercantile to industrial, pluralist, and democratic. Perhaps, in the face of radical change, the maintenance of reality comes to rest, at least in part, on the seriousness of things like religion, morals, and science, perhaps codifying social and material paradigms amidst uncertain times that might upset or render useless various socially constructed paradigms. Such a codification of the real and unreal in this story by characters like Julopper, the Men of the Bar, Dr. Torby, and Sir Bale seems an attempt to give communities a certainty and rootedness in a world that's becoming uncertain in the face of events that challenge their reality, as the Victorians themselves, and especially the Irish Victorians, were experiencing. The denial, therefore, of things that might upset this social and material reality can help to maintain that reality, for a time, at least. And I say for a time because we do see alternate visions of reality emerge in the Haunted Baronet. We have the idea that there's a ghost in the lake, that Bale's authority is suspect because of his cruelty, that the authority structures of the community are encountering something more powerful than they can handle. As Dr. Torby says of the story of the woman drowned in the lake, it's best forgotten, but that's not like to be. Despite the official narrative that we've seen maintained by authority figures in the aftermath of Feltrim's death, the unseen already has somewhat of a hold, because this story of the ghostly woman in the lake is told widely in this community, even though it's officially deemed unreal. Further, the story challenges the hereditary authority that rules the town. Depending on the veracity of the story, Feltrim could potentially be an inheritor of Sir Bale's estate due to his ancestor apparently having sex with and maybe even marrying Sir Bale's ancestor. This alternate narrative is foreclosed by structures of authority in the community, but it remains a presence here in the first part of the story, a kind of unofficial alternative to the official narrative Sir Bael helps keep in place. An unofficial narrative which will grow in power as the story goes on. It constitutes a kind of alternate vision of reality, which we can't fully understand, as it's ghostly, supernatural, and somewhat shadowed from us, but which violates the official sociopolitical and material vision of reality present in the Golden Friars community. However, for now, the hegemonic vision of social and material reality that reigns in Golden Friars might be safe. Feltrim's dead, his death's been explained away, it's medically verified, Bael's blameless, Torby's probably off to attest to that, being the gossip he is. Things are fine, back to normal, squared away. Or they would be if Feltrim stayed dead. And because he doesn't, the authority of these figures and the ability of this community to maintain its sense of reality and our ability to accept and propagate such a vision of reality start to become very, very precarious. So let's take a little break here and maybe come back in like 5 minutes or so. Perfect. So welcome back, everyone. We're in part 2 now, where we're going to focus a little bit more on Sir Bael. So when Feltrim's pulled under the lake and seemingly dies, we no longer have access to his perspective. Sir Bael's then kind of made what we might call our central protagonist. Through him, we've already seen an example of how authoritative power structures serve to direct this reality creation process, aiming it at upholding coherent schemes of reality, often at the expense of the vulnerable. Because we can see some of the obvious downsides of such men having so much power to maintain hegemony, perhaps one of the most fearful, yet maybe strangely joyful aspects of Le Fanu's fiction is that such power structures can get broken down a bit. Such tearing down of authority starts for us early in the Haunted Baronet. We see Sir Bael's cruelty. We know he helped cause Feltrim's death, which might give us some pause in accepting the vision of reality he upholds. Such deterioration intensifies, though, with Dr. Torby's claim, oops, my mouse is acting up a little bit, with Dr. Torby's claim that Feltrim's dead, because Feltrim, it seems, isn't. This incorrect diagnosis alone undermines Torby's attitude of casual confidence in his own medical authority. Now, in fairness to the doctor, it's hard to even say that it was wrong to pronounce Feltrim dead. The lack of a concrete explanation as to what actually happened to Feltrim means that it's entirely possible Feltrim actually died and was supernaturally revived. However, that uncertainty leaves us either to conclude that Torby is dangerously incompetent as a figure of medical authority, or that his medical knowledge cannot account for this event. The edifice of his expertise, and thus our ability to buy into the medical authority of this community and its ability to protect its community members, is broken either way, meaning a key point on the Gramscian power structure of this community is compromised by the otherworldly. And therefore, his attempts to maintain a coherent power structure in the community by excluding lower class figures like the fishermen from valid subjectivity, for example, those efforts might also be undermined. In undermining his authority, this event, Feltrim's death and his resurrection, becomes disruptive of that official narrative of what social and material reality is. With Feltrim alive, something outside the Golden Friars scheme of reality emerges to challenge that power structure and potentially fracture the authority of these figures and the official narrative about what is and is not real. Bianca del Villano, in her work Ghostly Alterities, which is a really good book if any of you would like to read it, examines the radical power of ghosts and ghostly figures to demonstrate the necessity of new narratives. The presence of ghostly figures, she says, suggests there are further stories and modernities to be narrated. Thus, the ghost becomes a sublime tool to open a space where we can start to unveil the heart of darkness and modernity, and open a door to what is beyond reason in order to breach the wall of reality represented by culture. In Le Fanu's fiction, we bear witness to a variety of supernatural and non-supernatural disruptors who perform this function. They similarly confront the limits of a particular vision of reality through their presence in the story and point to the need for other possibilities. Feltrim's return, this seemingly supernatural event, is similar in so much as it challenges those social and material rules about what constitutes reality by socially and materially violating that reality, perhaps prompting us to begin considering visions of reality beyond the official one that authority figures have presented to us, giving more consideration, perhaps, to that alternate narrative I mentioned at the end of section 1. When he's resurrected, Feltrim is seemingly changed into a mysterious, possibly possessed supernatural figure who can't be fully understood by the conjoined perspectives of us and our narrator. He started out as somewhat of a mouse, saying at one point, "God knows I would not hurt Sir Bael nor give him one uneasy hour." Yet once he's revived, he's described like this: "A change more comprehensive than at first appeared had taken place, and a singular alteration was gradually established. He grew thin, his eyes hollow, his face gradually forbidding. His ways and temper were changed. He was a new man with Sir Bael, and the baronet, after a time, people said, began to grow afraid of him. And certainly Feltrim had acquired an extraordinary influence over the baron, who a little while ago had regarded and treated him with so much contempt." Crucial here are both the marked change in Feltrim and that change in power dynamics. This encounter with that which is deemed officially unreal, in which the unreal has broken through the surface of the lake and pulled Feltrim in, has turned Feltrim into something unknowable. He now belongs more to this unseen reality that we can't fully comprehend than that of Goldenfriars, something that's marked in his kind of physical and emotional alteration. Indeed, he now seems to be an agent of this other reality, as we'll see later on. Further, the invasion of the unreal has altered the power structure of the community. No longer does Sir Bael, as authority figure, hold power over Feltrim. Instead, Feltrim is the one with influence now, exerting it over this authority figure. This power structure, so crucial to the community's sense of reality, is therefore not just undermined in Feltrim's revival, it's corrupted. Feltrim, seemingly pulled into this alternate ghostly reality, is now controlling Sir Bael in service of that other reality. Feltrim's influence grows as he starts engaging his former tormentor in Faustian bargains, which start to win Sir Bael money. Feltrim brings Sir Bael to what he calls the gypsies, who predict with great accuracy the results of local horse races, winning Sir Bael enough money to save him from financial ruin. Bael is brought to them through a path in the woods, one that cannot, it seems, be traversed with a map, but rather must be accessed through mystical means, indicating a journey away from Sir Bael's reality, where maps and not magic mark distance and place. Not only has the power structure of the community been corrupted by this otherworldly Feltrim exerting power over Bael, Sir Bael is now being physically transported to places whose navigational metrics seem to fall outside of his reality. Feltrim, it seems, was pulled from the Goldenfriars' reality and made an agent of this unseen supernatural reality. Sir Bael is perhaps in the process of being pulled from that Goldenfriars' reality. It's important to note that the gypsy identity ascribed to the fortune teller Sir Bael goes to here. In the collection the story is a part of, Roma people, and I'm assuming Le Fanu is referring to Roma communities in Britain in the 18th and 19th century. It's a little bit ambiguous, so I'm kind of making an assumption here, but that seems to be what it is. Roma people seem to have a major presence around the community of Goldenfriars, even though they remain separate from that community. In their own way, Roma people in this text are figured as members of an alternate reality. There's generally a mutual inability between members of the Goldenfriars community and members of the Roma community to fully comprehend one another's way of life. And the communities have different relationships to the supernatural, have different power structures, and have generally different social organization. Now, not great representation to have Roma people figured as kind of an alternate reality. We're dealing with 19th century ethnic and racial configurations, which obviously aren't great. As we also find the use of the term gypsy here. So apologies for all of those things that are coming through in my talk because of Le Fanu's own, personal stuff. Now, this Roma fortune teller is a woman in black mourning clothes, accompanied by her financier who wears garish, outdated clothing. Through her fortune telling, she holds Sir Bale's fortune, that very thing that maintains his authoritative place within his community, in her hands. So might the power of this key authority figure, Sir Bale, be in the hands of a Roma reality? Is this Roma reality exerting control over the reality of the Golden Friars community through its greater ability to talk about, through its greater ability to countenance the supernatural? Is it, in other words, taking over? That explanation perhaps doesn't entirely fit in with whatever the supernatural beings in the lake are, who seem to be connected with the sins of Sir Bale's ancestors. Though perhaps these ghostly beings might be in league with the Roma, we just don't know. Now, perhaps we might say Feltrim was lying, or our narrator was misinformed about the gypsy identity he ascribes to this fortune teller. The Roma financier's outdated clothing actually matches those depicted in a portrait of an ancestor of Feltrim's, which Sir Bale had once seen. So perhaps this figure is actually a ghost of the vengeful Feltrim family. Are these disparate supernatural figures all vengeful Feltrim family ghosts who are trying to gain power over Sir Bale and gain revenge for the sins of the father? After all, the woman in black reappears later in the story and calls herself a kinswoman. But then why this quite circuitous method of taking power from Sir Bale? And why punish Feltrim, killing him and possessing him, if the ghosts are related to him and are revenging the wrongs done to his ancestors? Plus, the narrator insinuates, but never proves, that perhaps this fortune teller was never there, or perhaps was a Roma fortune teller all along who Bale kind of unconsciously projected this Feltrim family portrait onto. Bale has had a bad fever at this point in the story, and so perhaps nothing supernatural is going on. And we're just receiving second, third, or fourth-hand accounts that originated in a fevered, hallucinating mind. But there are so many coincidences in the story, like the men at the bar just happening to talk about the same kind of ghostly phenomenon that is independently confirmed by fishermen to have killed Feltrim. Unless the narrator is just kind of making all of this up, it just seems that this all might be a bit too coincidental. Even if the explanation of this haunting is just a ghostly Feltrim family revenge, even if this is perhaps the most satisfying explanation out of all of these possible explanations, such a conclusion must be drawn by the reader, as it's not made all that clear by the narrator, and it simply can't be confirmed. We have to make an effort to explain why this might be the explanation for everything that happens, which thwarts any certainty we might have about any particular all-encompassing explanation. So if this all seems confusing, it's because it totally is. We can't fully make sense of or ensure we're right about whatever's initiating and facilitating the action of this plot. The narrator assures us that people of the present don't bear the same tendency for superstition as people in the time of the story, which further shows that the narrator's perspective is aligned more with the official rational reality of Golden Friars than this alternate ghostly one that the narrator can't quite seem to describe or comprehend. Despite alluding to a lack of their own superstitious beliefs, though, the narrator provides the reader no clear way to understand what the supernatural is. They may not be superstitious, but they can't seem to provide any clear framework to understand this story in an unsupernatural light. And whatever it is, It's exerting a tremendous control over the community. Something, it seems, this reality just doesn't have the tools to understand or combat. Previously, we talked about how we're viewing this world by joining our perception to the narrators, thus engaging with and perhaps internalizing a perspective aligned more with the official Golden Friars' vision of reality, mostly viewing the world through that constructed framework. However, this framework in which we're attempting to gaze upon Le Fanu's world, it's just not sufficient to explain what's going on here, making us feel the vulnerability of these characters who can't account for or contain these unreal figures or events, or really stymie their advances. In encountering the supernatural through this tale, we're meeting something that we cannot understand by internalizing that Golden Friars framework of reality. We feel that danger of encountering something that falls outside this vision of reality. This visceral encounter with inexplicable alterity happens elsewhere in Le Fanu's fiction too, especially in his short story collection In a Glass Darkly. For example, Hesselius, again the narrator of Green Tea, and the collector of all the documents that make up In a Glass Darkly, attempts to join the spiritual and scientific as a spiritualist physician. Connectedly, Jennings, the simian-afflicted clergyman who Hesselius attempts to treat, is surrounded by treatises and experts attempting to theorize and understand the supernatural within clear frameworks. Indeed, throughout In a Glass Darkly, we see consistent attempts to negotiate the supernatural's place in their vision of reality. However, these supernatural figures baffle attempts to cleanly integrate such supernaturalism into their vision of reality. Jennings, based on the spiritualist books he's reading, says his affliction is a supernatural illusion that everyone's read of. He's thus attempting to contain his affliction, both as something not entirely real, as it's an illusion, and something that could be contained within common knowledge. As such, his affliction is not real and can be collectively mastered by his community. Jennings reassures himself in vain, though, saying later that he believed not one word of his self-assurances, no more than any other miserable being ever did who was once seized and riveted in this satanic captivity. Against my convictions, he says, I might say my knowledge, I was simply bullying myself into false courage. And the explanation that this affliction is just a disease flies in the face of another potential framework this text gives us for understanding the various ghostly afflictions of Green Tea and the collection it's part of. That this haunting is a spiritual affliction of the kind Emanuel Swedenborg theorized about. Swedenborg was a real-world, profoundly influential spiritualist thinker. And this Swedenborgian framework maintains that hell and those spirits that emerge from it are quite real and potentially dangerous when one opens their internal sight, a mode of sight that allegedly allows one to see such spirits. We can't fully confirm which, if any of these frameworks for understanding the problem are correct, though, as none of them save Jennings. His affliction might be a spectral illusion, but Jennings doubts this. No amount of reassurance that it's not real is able to pull him back from the edge, and it all becomes so horrible that he kills himself. And Dr. Hesselius, our narrator, subscribes to a Swedenborgian framework to understand the supernatural, but he and it spectacularly failed to treat Jennings, despite Hesselius telling us this framework is great. Thus, this inability to contain this supernatural entity within any clear, actionable, rational framework reveals gaps in Jennings' community's ability to deal with this affliction. Potentially satisfying explanations become difficult or impossible to confirm. We feel that here in the Haunted Baronet as well, where the presence of these inexplicable supernatural beings creates doubt in the framework through which we're viewing this world. And we feel the fear of our principal characters because we can find no adequate framework for understanding or acting on these supposedly unreal events afflicting them. If we're imagining ourselves existing in Le Fanu's world, like these works call us to do, where we're reading a real world document about our world, We're bearing remote witness to things we might not be able to comprehend or combat ourselves, if our vision of reality at all resembles that of these characters and our narrator, which it very well likely could. What would happen if we encountered such unreal things? Should we try to formulate new visions of reality, refusing to internalize the reality frameworks being presented to us in this narrative and likely in our own community? We talked before about how the Ascendancy felt other possibilities for Irish future creeping in, gaining more power, becoming capable of realizing their vision of an Irish future, instead of one where the Ascendancy reigned on. I don't think the Haunted Baronet is an allegory for that necessarily, but I think it allows us to feel that fear, that one's vision of reality is flawed and could be getting replaced by another vision that might better operate in the world. We see it both in the story, as the power structures of the community are corrupted, as material vision of reality and unreality are violated. And we see it as our own ability to internalize such a reality becomes uncertain. We therefore might better understand how members of the Ascendancy community might have felt as they encountered similar doubt about their way of life. Now, recognition of such inadequacy might necessitate changing one's vision of reality to better accommodate the lived experience of those in the community, especially the vulnerable, who are most at risk when such frameworks of reality become obviously inadequate. But so often, such changes fail to happen in Le Fanu's text. Authority figures like Torby work to preserve reality and their own authority at the expense of the vulnerable. Torby, for example, denies the fisherman's subjectivity, or at least denies its validity, and seems to back up Bale's assertion that the whole mess is Feltrim's fault. They sacrifice the vulnerable, they preserve their reality, and they ultimately don't change, which seems, under the circumstances, a bit inadvisable. But again, like at the end of section 1, things seem to be okay by the end of this section of the story. Bale's made his money, albeit by kind of shady, apparently supernatural means. And he's married a woman named Janet, a distant Feltrim family relation. Things seem better, a sense of normalcy is restored. And yet, now that this reality creation process has been corrupted somewhat, what happens as this looming ghostly reality gains even more power? Can the Golden Friar's reality, so cracked in its encounter with the unseen, be restored? With that lingering question in mind, let's take another quick 5-minute or so break. All right, part 3, welcome back everyone. So in the last part of the Haunted Baronet, we see the remaining events of this story largely through the eyes of 4 women we haven't met yet. Those women being Janet, Mary, Gertrude, and especially Maud, who are all related. Now, as I'm sure you've seen, the story is already complicated enough as it is, and it gets especially so in this last third. So let's try focusing for the most part here on Janet, the woman who for some reason becomes attracted to and marries Sir Bale, as well as Maud, her sister, who tries to hold things together despite these women becoming steadily more and more affected by this supernatural other reality. And what we're seeing here, or what we will see here, is the steady disintegration of the ability of Sir Bale, Janet, Maud, Mary, Gertrude, and us, the readers, to occupy the singular sense of reality that people like Sir Bale and Dr. Torby had attempted to hold. And what's damaging their ability to do so is this alternate invading reality, which, it seems, is siphoning away power from the Golden Friar's reality. Throughout the story, we've seen various policing institutions attempt to reinforce a clear sense of reality. Miss Julep applying drinks, Sir Bale intervening into the interpretation of Feltrim's death, and Dr. Torby reaffirming natural laws while also upholding Sir Bale's authority. We thus have this ostensibly coherent sense of reality that perhaps resembles our own in some ways, which bumps up against some other reality, something that might be deemed to be unreal from the perspective of this community and its authority figures. However, it nonetheless seems to constitute its own vision of what is socially and materially real, which violates the vision of reality possessed by the Golden Friars community. And perhaps in violating that vision of reality, it might be better capable of navigating Le Fanu's fictional world. This attempt to create and maintain a singular reality is thus constantly under threat in Le Fanu's fictional communities, and the power of these communities is often at risk of being siphoned away by another reality. We've already seen this siphoning somewhat through the manner in which our previous primary point of view characters, Feltrim and Sir Bael, have been siphoned away into this other reality. Feltrim went first, getting pulled directly into the lake and afterwards becoming an agent of this other reality. And now Sir Bael becomes further detached from his reality and from us. We were pretty close with Sir Bael. We heard his thoughts, followed his actions, centered on him as a proper protagonist. However, near the end of the story, Sir Bael becomes afflicted with supernatural knowledge. He learns, though we can't quite be sure how, that he's going to die before the next sunrise, presumably by this other reality. He's then fully given over to this other reality. He believes in the supernatural knowledge fully and ultimately finds himself completely in the power of these occupants of an alternate supernatural reality. Whereas before they possessed control over his finances and respectability, they now, it seems, control when he will die. Perhaps because both Feltrim and Bael have left the Golden Friars' reality somewhat as we reach the end of the story, our narrator simply cannot occupy their perspective anymore, as the narrator's perspective seems much closer and familiar with the perspective of the Golden Friars' reality, as opposed to the otherworldly, invading one. In a sense, in this last third of the story, we're occupying the perspective of those who are left within this community's reality, as this alternate reality in the form of the mysterious fortune teller, the woman in the lake, the revivified Feltrim, and the other supernatural figures we've experienced slowly picks off our characters, almost like a slasher villain, making us unable to occupy their perspective from our frameworks of reality, and leaving the community's sense of social and material reality increasingly damaged in its wake. It picks off Feltrim, then Sir Bael, removing them from the Golden Friars' reality until we're left in the point of view of our final girls, we might call them, Maud and Janet, who remain perhaps tenuously in this Golden Friars' reality. Maud eventually travels to Sir Bael's estate to be with Janet, who's in absolute distress due to Sir Bael's premonition. And there we come to a kind of final rhetorical battleground between these two visions of reality. And all the while, the wider community seems to be changing. Darkness and snow start to cover the town, mirroring the doubt that creeps in and overtakes each of these characters, preventing them from subscribing to their community's vision of reality. Notably, the ending we're hurtling towards is characterized by silence. Indeed, the last chapter is called Hush. As social constructionist theory holds, reality is made through interactions among people. Silence, we can almost see as the opposite of that process. Maud attempts to use language to fill in the silence, to assure Janet that Sir Bael will not die, in the process reinforcing the paradigms of their reality in which it's impossible for someone to supernaturally know with certainty the hour of their death. The narrator states, Maud's address was kind and cheery, and her air confident. For a moment, a ray of hope returned, and her sister Janet acknowledged at least the possibility of her theory. But if confidence is contagious, so also is panic. Maud experienced a sinking of the heart, in which she dared not confess to her sister and vainly strove to combat. We see panic here as a force that has entered into this verbal reality creation process that disrupts confidence in a particular scheme of reality. A panic that becomes more and more extreme as these women await Sir Bale's fate, where his supernatural knowledge must be confirmed or denied. So while Maud's language reinforces the community's reality, panic due to the supernatural creeps in and pushes back in their interaction. And in that growing panic, silence also grows. The narrator states, the sisters gradually grew more and more silent. An unearthly suspense overhung them all, and Janet rose every now and then and listened at the open door for step or voice in vain. They were all overpowered by the intenser horror that seemed gathering around them. This alternate reality, the encounter of which has caused this horror for these women, seems to be pulling in closer, winning and surrounding them. In a rhetorical sally for her reality, Maud attempts to reassure her sisters that Sir Bale must be mistaken. In doing so, though, she unconsciously emphasizes the perspectival rather than essential nature of her reality. She states, come, darling, you must not be so foolish. We can only talk of impressions, and we're imposed upon by the solemnity of Sir Bale's manner, and the fact that he evidently believes in his own delusion. Everyone does believe in his own delusion. There's nothing strange in that. Delusion is inherently tied to individual perception, much as it is when the vampire hunting general in Carmilla tells the protagonist's vampire doubting father that you believe in nothing but what consists with your own prejudices and illusions. In Maud's account, everyone is so deluded, so taken with their own prejudices and illusions. Is her own vision of reality, like Sir Bale's supernatural perspective, a delusion then? It seems quite possible if everyone is deluded. Further, if what Maud is saying is true, if everyone is deluded, the act of reality creation in Le Fanu's fictional communities must rely on characters of deluded perception and prejudices in communication with one another to configure reality. How can we count on such a reality to be correct or even adequate, especially with so much evidence that it isn't, that it doesn't allow its occupants to adequately navigate the world? The reality she occupies is therefore, by her unconscious admission, vulnerable, by nature of being built among deluded individuals like Torby, Bale, Miss Julopper, and the men at the bar. If everyone is deluded, then the Golden Friar's reality around her might be a similar delusion to Sir Bale's presentiment of his own death. And in the end, Sir Bale does die before sunrise. His supernatural delusion seems less deluded than the regimes of knowledge that Maud is promoting. Her own communally created vision of reality is the one that is revealed to be a deluded prejudice, which she can no longer, it seems, attempt to defend. Even before he's died, silence descends on these women like the snow that falls and accumulates over Golden Friars. The narrator states, pale and silent those three beautiful sisters sat. The horrible quietude of a suspense that had grown all but insupportable oppressed the guests of Jen, and something like the numbness of despair had reduced her to silence, the dreadful counterfeit of peace. The silence descends. The language that might have communally maintained reality can no longer be produced. Much as Feltrim and Sir Bale became unable to occupy the reality they started in, so too might we see these women, surrounded by this silence, be unable to fully occupy that reality any longer in the face of Sir Bale's death. As a result, the processes by which reality is collectively linguistically maintained have been stopped, changed to silence. There's no more speech rendered between them after Bale's death. So we might see that the ability of these characters to occupy their reality has been damaged. The confidence in authority figures to keep characters in that reality is cracked. The integrity of authority structures and coherent schemes of knowledge, like medical knowledge, have been brought into question, if not outright proven wrong. As if to underline this point about medical knowledge, Dr. Torby comes back and tells everyone, look, Sir Bale's fine. Everything's going to be fine. He's not dying. Obviously, is proven wrong. Some sites of authority have even at times been controlled by otherworldly figures, as was the case with Bale and the fortune teller. Thus, the Gramscian power structures of the community have been damaged, and the paradigms of what is socially and materially acceptable and real have been undermined in this encounter with another reality. That otherworldly reality, as I've suggested before, even strikes out at us, the reader. At the start, I discussed how we, as readers of Le Fanu's work, are called to imaginatively occupy Le Fanu's world and are reading real documents that are by their perspectival nature imperfect lenses into events that have happened in this fictional world. To summarize what I've already said, by calling us to read these works as real-world documents in a world we imaginatively occupy, these works are implicating us in this reality creation process. In a narrative that didn't experience such unreal disruptions, or even if we were able to find a coherent explanation for the supernatural by engaging with the narrator's perspective, we might be able to unproblematically internalize the narrator's frameworks of reality, which seem to harmonize with the official perspective of this Golden Friars reality. And if we're existing in Le Fanu's world, imaginatively that is, we might imagine ourselves engaging with others, communicating with them, and further reifying elements of this internalized perspective. This reality creation process could go on smoothly. A coherent vision of reality might be maintained for us, and we would have a role in maintaining it. After all, the official vision of reality exhibited in Golden Friars extends across many of Le Fanu's fictional communities with minor variations. So we would be able to better uphold a similar vision of reality in our own environments in Le Fanu's world. But as we've discussed, doubt has already crept in regarding our ability to unproblematically internalize that reality due to our inability to comprehend the supernatural through that perspective, or to comprehend whatever spooky things happening in the story. Like the supernatural violated Sir Bale's ability to occupy this reality, it violates our ability to internalize it. Victor Sage has discussed how one of Le Fanu's early collections, the Purcell Papers, strikes out and destabilizes the boundaries between past and present, as well as destabilizes an intended skeptical Protestant reader's perspective on superstition, as we were talking about in one of the breaks. Sage insightfully shows here how Le Fanu closes the distance between reader and narrative, and that the narrative can therefore strike out at the bounds of our perception. In The Haunted Baronet, something similar is happening. The narrator might try to assure us that we exist in enlightened times, free from superstition. But we've just seen the supernatural overcome attempts to reinforce this reality as we see more and more of the supernatural, as we watch Feltrim become changed, as we watch Sir Bale predict his own death, and as we hear about hands reaching through the lake and grabbing passersby. And all the while engaging with the narrator's perspective, we're unable to encompass such supernatural figures within the reality frameworks of a community like Golden Friars. Because the supernatural resists our ability to understand such figures, in our community with the narrator's limited perspective. Because this happens, and because we see how attempts to maintain a Golden Friars sense of reality fail, the supernatural carried to us on the written word shows us the futility of trying to internalize and reproduce this supposedly rational, enlightened vision of reality. In fact, the narrator of The Haunted Baronet explicitly, if maybe unintentionally, closes the distance between us and the supernatural, making it more immediate, making us more unable to accept that reality. Near the beginning of the story, shortly after Feltrim flees Sir Bale's estate, Sir Bale sees three men approach his house, and the narrator states, "We have all experienced what a presentiment is, and we all know with what an intuition the faculty of observation is sometimes heightened. It was such an apprehension as sometimes gives its peculiar horror to a dream, a sort of knowledge that what those people were about was in a dreadful way connected with his own fate. These men, we learn, that are approaching Bale's house, are bringing the lifeless feltrim home, an event that marks the beginning of Sir Bale's encounter with the unreal. His doom-filled presentiment is correct here. And this presentiment is something the narrator seems to be saying is something that kind of happens to all of us. Further, in a quotation I mentioned earlier, the narrator states, "There is a faculty in man that will acknowledge the unseen. He may scout and scare religion from him, but if he does, superstition perches near." Superstition, it seems, perches near human beings as part of the human condition. These quotations implicate us not so much in a process of maintaining that Golden Friar style in reality, as telling us we're like those who experience the unreal. The witness we bear to the supernatural, the ways in which it violates the reality we are meant to be helping communally reproduce, become intensified because we ourselves are told we're like Bale, or really any of these characters who experience things that pull them out of their reality. By reading the text, we can see the supernatural brought before us, violating the perspective we're meant to internalize. And with quotations like these, we might feel such forces around us, breathing down our necks, threatening to affect us too, as was the case for the women at the end of the Haunted Baronet, alongside the terrifying knowledge that we simply cannot combat them through the perspective of this reality. We cannot accept this vision of reality that we know can't protect us from the unseen forces we might start to suspect are all around us. The other reality has affected us, therefore. Like Feltrim, Sir Bale, and Maud, it becomes difficult or impossible for us to accept this reality that characterizes the constructed lens through which we're viewing these events. We can feel that other visions of reality might be necessary to adequately navigate this fictional world we've been called into, in which, it seems, we all experience supernatural phenomena like presentiments. This points to the importance, I think, of existing in the totality of this work, as Mieville said, rather than reducing it to pure allegory. By occupying the fictional space the story sets out for us, we can feel that critical intuition hit us viscerally. We can feel quite viscerally our encounter with a supernatural reality and how it feels to be asked to exist within a supposedly ideal but faltering, vitally flawed reality that we can't fully subscribe to if we want to have any chance of navigating this world with a degree of safety. And despite the fact that the novel ends with a kind of social restoration, in which Philip Feltrim's brother, a minor character in the story, becomes the new baronet, we really trust or engage in upholding the social order anymore, which seems to be at the whims of this supernatural reality that can operate in this world so much more ably? And can we fully support such a restoration of a kind of social order when this order has been shown to sacrifice the vulnerable for its own maintenance? We viscerally feel that anxiety again about the reality we're inhabiting being insufficient. That anxiety many among the ascendancy class felt. Again, I don't claim that this story is necessarily an allegory for the situation of the ascendancy, but rather that the situation of the community of Golden Friars here bears resonances of the ascendancy situation. To say that this community with its power structures centered on maintaining social and material reality completely matches the diverse lived experience of the ascendancy class would be disingenuous. And yet, the social dynamics we've seen displayed here might give us an empathetic view of the uncertainties of living in the 19th century Irish social context, as well as a warning against certain malicious, ineffective ways of dealing with that uncertainty. The encroach of Irish nationalists and their victories over ascendancy visions of reality might find resonance in this invading other reality of the Haunted Baronet. As nationalists won victories and the socio-political structures of ascendancy Ireland started to increase in uncertainty, the sense that an alternate reality was damaging and overcoming a reigning sense of reality starts to seem all the more immediate. And this relates to a broader Victorian context as well. As Robin Gilmore states, the Victorians were navigating in uncharted waters. They were a people living through tremendous advancements and transitions that shook frameworks of material and social reality. The need for societies in Le Fanu's fiction to desperately maintain coherent paradigms of reality resonates strongly with the need of many Victorians to similarly negotiate the frameworks within which to live their lives in a time that threatened to expose the woeful inadequacy of some existing social and material paradigms. New ways of viewing the material world, like evolution, which I mentioned previously, might start to take power from previous worldviews, as might new regimes of socio-political organization, much like how the ghostly reality of this story siphoned power away from the Golden Friars' reality. And there might be a warning here too about the danger of an inability to change one's reality to better protect the vulnerable. In The Haunted Baronet, before Feltrim is apparently drowned, a kind of prophet comes to Surveil and warns him about his cruelty. He states, "Ye must change, or Feltrim will change. Go in weakness, come in power. Mark ye the words. 'Twill make a peal that will be heard in town and desert, in the swirls of the mountain, through pikes and valleys, and make a whaley man of thee." Of course, Surveil doesn't heed this warning, and Feltrim does change and does become an agent of this other reality. Sometimes, in Le Fanu's tales, other realities attack authority figures. They take possession of aristocrats, military men, or clergymen. Other times, though, they come and take possession of the poor, or those deemed mentally ill, or girls, or those really who've been divested to a certain extent of authority in the reality creation process of Le Fanu's texts. The downtrodden nature of these populations and the subsequent lack of agency or valid subjectivity afforded them are what enables the other reality to take control of them to varying degrees. This happened with Feltrim, who's possessed precisely because his social context, and specifically the most important authority figure in his life, make him so powerless, thus driving him into the lake and into the possession of this other reality. His lack of agency makes him easy prey, which the other reality can use to gain power and strengthen their attack. An attempt to better enable the agency of the vulnerable and validate their subjectivity could help in this regard. Surveil changing the exercise of his authority could have prevented Feltrim from being taken by this other reality. Had the fishermen who discussed the ghosts that pulled Feltrim into the lake been countenanced, perhaps the community could have better understood and prepared for the supernatural events in the story. Of course, that relies on these authority figures taking the fishermen seriously, countenancing their subjectivity, which they don't do ultimately. Indeed, one of the narratives pushed by real-world Irish nationalists was one of dispossession. The British colonial project had dispossessed them of their land, their language, their culture, their voice, which are well-founded accusations based on what we all know about the practices of British colonialism, the very system that helped prop up the Protestant ascendancy. And such accusations lent credence to the nationalist cause, to this alternate vision of an Irish future. The sacrificing of the agency and subjectivity, and even the bodies of the vulnerable here becomes a grave injustice in Le Fanu's text. That act of sacrificing the vulnerable, while aimed at maintaining a clear sense of reality, often undermines it, much as the actions of the British colonial regime undermined its own ability to realize a British colonialist future for Ireland. Therefore, in Le Fanu's works, instead of one-to-one allegorical representation of these ascendancy concerns, we're made to see and imagine ourselves as part of the flawed social processes that uphold reality in the midst of events that threaten that reality, thus becoming viscerally engaged in the story's commentary on how particular ways of life might be maintained and how they might be rendered untenable in ways eminently relevant to Le Fanu's Ireland. Further, this fiction bears social relevance that extends beyond an ascendancy or a Victorian context. This anxiety that our reality, our rules of what is acceptable or unreal, might be incapable of adequately navigating us through the world is something I'm sure we've all felt in some way. That realization that our reality is constructed and therefore might be destroyed, that it's not as stable as we might have imagined, that growing sense that authority figures might be incapable of upholding our reality, that our community might be sacrificing the vulnerable at the altar of maintaining an insufficient, perhaps even untenable way of life. Even sometimes that there might be little point in attempting to uphold that flawed way of life. Additionally, we, or people close to us, might even experience the drive exhibited by authority figures in this text to reify our community's social and material rules, even as we see those rules might crumble. For example, our experience of COVID as a worldwide community has made even more apparent the profound iniquities in our societies. And we've borne witness to the suffering that comes in the wake of those iniquities, and in the wake of the failure of our authority structures to navigate this context to the benefit of the vulnerable. And even still, with those iniquities plain before us, we might sometimes feel that desire for restoration rather than change. Like Dr. Torby, we might feel that urge to uphold and maintain our reality, despite the situations that are prompting or even necessitating a rethinking of that reality. And as we've viscerally experienced in Le Fanu's text, that restorative impulse might just hasten our descent towards our demise, making our reality all the more unable to adequately account for the world around us. And we might begin to feel that, perhaps, in the failures of our reality to allow our community to navigate the world, some other reality might just challenge it and win. Thank you very much.